So I just want to, again, thank you all very much for giving me a little bit of time in the classroom, or actually a lot of time in the classroom, to talk about a process that I was involved in. When I asked Shelley if I could do this, we talked a little bit about this particular process that I was involved in, and to make a long story short, this is a really unique and rare opportunity that I had, and I'm not 100% sure how it actually came to be for me, except through a lot of circumstances and luckiness that came together. But I got to, for about 7 years, work with people that were survivors of Indian residential schools in Canada. And so what we're going to do is talk a little bit about that process and talk about what it was like for me as a clinician to be involved in a healing process that was deeply grounded in local spiritual practice. So the Wallstukiek actually get their name from a river, which is called the Wallstuk, and now today that river is called the St. John's River. But in the original language, in their Algonquin, it means beautiful river, and Wallstukiek means people of the beautiful river. And this tribe of people have been there since antiquity, before Americans came here, and the place where I met them was a place called Tobic. And Tobic is a reserve that's about 70 miles from the Holton Crossing in the Maine border. It's probably about a 7-hour drive from where we are right now. And in the work with them, I drew this up there to point out that Tobic is a reserve, and it's one of 6 reserves in Canada. There's a 7th reserve in Maine. And these 7 reserves hold about 2/3 of the remaining Wallstukiek people. They number about 3,000. They are members of the Wabanaki Confederacy, and their first contact with Europeans was in the 1600s. And so this, Tobic, is the largest reserve. And what's interesting about it is that I drew this triangle so you could see where it was on the map, but that's probably about 50 times bigger than the actual reserve itself is. And so the reason I pointed that out to you is because this land here is the land that was inhabited by the Wallstukiek before we West Europeans came here. Some people call the Wallstukiek Maliseet. The people in the tribe themselves actually don't like that name. That's a name that was given by them by other members of the Wabanaki Confederation, people that inhabited this part of Canada that are known as the Micmac. And the Micmac word for speaking bad Algonquin is Maliseet. And so the Maliseet themselves are much fewer in number than the Micmac. And so they've been given that name, but they themselves prefer to be called the Wallstukiek. So one of the problems when going back before the 1600s is that there aren't really excellent counts of how many Wallstukiek there were. And there's not a great information about how many people were lost in the Great Death. And the Great Death was basically from about 1660 to the early 1700s, where enormous numbers of native people died related to diseases that were brought here from Europeans. And so on some level, guesses are as high as there may have been 100,000 Wallstukiek before colonialization. There's really, today there are 3,000, probably 4,000. I'm sorry, I'm saying a little bit, that number's probably a little bit low. There's about 4,000 today. And early, this land that we call Canada, the first people to come into it were the French. And the French encountered the Wusturic very early in colonialization period. And at that time, important to this conversation, many Wusturic were converted to Catholicism. And so that's just something to kind of to keep in the background as we talk about this moving forward. Other points that are important to understand is that the very first Indian residential schools that started in Canada started really in the 1830s, but they weren't called Indian residential schools at that point. What they were Catholic and Anglican schools opened up across Canada and offered free Western education to First Nation people. And that model was seen to have been good for the First Nation people at that time, and it was seen to be good for Canada at that time. So it was kind of this early practice that started the Indian residential schools. The actual Indian, and most of them that were opened up in Western Canada. So another thing that makes the Wusturic interesting when you have a discussion about Indian residential schools is that Indian residential schools came to Eastern Canada a long, long time after they were in Western Canada, about 100 years later. And so, in case it's not obvious to people about why that was, the Eastern Canadian First Nation people were assimilated into Eastern Canadian culture while there was still ongoing disputes about land and territory in Western Canada. So when you hear about Indian residential schools in Canada, one point to take from this is that there's not just one kind. There are many, many different kinds of Indian residential schools in Canada. And so it's also important to understand that about 23% of all the people at the Tobic Reserve, whose total populations is about 1,000, at the time I worked there, it fluctuated between 800 and 1,100, but it's about 1,000 people. About 23% of the people that were at Tobic when I started working that had actually been to Indian residential school. And the reason that number is important to take a look at is that you're going to understand pretty quickly what the Indian residential school was about, unless you know already. But people didn't go there voluntarily. And so the reasons people went to Indian residential school are important to understand, and how people got there and the numbers they did are important to understand. And that number was the number of all Tobic born between 1910 and 1950 that went to those schools. And the school that most of the Wusturic attended was this one, Shubenaki Indian Residential School. And the school itself was only open for 37 years. It was closed in 1967. It burned to the ground in 1986. But between the time it closed and the time it burned down, it was used for nothing. And pictures of this school, or this picture of this school in particular, is one that I've seen in a lot of different places. This is a picture that brings a lot of concern and discourse to people that went to, and distress to people who went to this school. About 1,000 children went to the school while it was open. The school represented a partnership between the Canadian government and the Catholic Church. It was supposed to, the goal of the school when it opened up was to help First Nation people out of poverty and into a way where they could be, important contributing members of the Canadian economy. And it's also important to know that, like I said before, the children were taken outside of their parents' permission. Children would try to escape. Parents would try to come to the school and free their children from the school, and were met with military resistance from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who are not the same as American police. Are there Canadian citizens in there? So the Royal Canadian Mounted Police are a paramilitary organization, and they have and human rights in Canada and police rights in Canada are a little bit different than they are here in the United States. So this was important to me because, and I'm sorry this picture didn't come out well, but this is a very powerful picture, and it's one that's been shared from Shubenacadie for a long period of time, and it's a picture of young people probably in the 1940s in a sewing class. And what was interesting to me was the first time I saw this picture, I saw it as it was shown in a documentary about the school. I really tried to find the documentary for this class, I couldn't. But when I was watching the documentary, it was literally the first 7 hours I'd actually been on the reserve in Tobic. And I was sitting behind a woman who was about 70 years old. And she, while we were in the classroom, told me that she remembered the nun, who is hard to see, but she's back there, and remembered the classroom and remembered the day that people came and took the picture. And it was a very powerful experience for me as a trauma therapist to be sitting in a classroom with somebody who was being shown a documentary about their trauma. And it actually, brought this experience alive to me in a way that I hadn't ever considered before. So basically, if you had to pick a starting point, if you wanted to be a scholar on Indian residential schools, you go to the Indian Act of 1879. But to be honest, there are several laws in Canada predating the Indian Act and after the Indian Act that had significant influence on the development of Indian residential schools. But the theory here behind this law was a very simple one. The theory was that First Nation people in Canada needed to be assimilated into the main European culture in Canada for a variety of reasons. Not the least of which was the economic value to the overall ability for the nation of Canada to produce. And so the Prime Minister at that time basically also thought that because there were these, parochial schools throughout Canada that offered free education, well, it wasn't really free, I guess I should say that now. The cost of going to the parochial school was you had to adopt the religion of the parochial school. And while we've talked about Eastern Canada, which is primarily Catholic, because remember the French settled first, the rest of Canada, or a lot of the rest of Canada, is not just French, it's also English. So there were other churches involved, specifically the Anglican Church, the Methodist Church, and the Presbyterian churches had these schools throughout once they started to become funded. And so the idea here was that if you got this parochial education, that people would then become Christian. And so you can see why on the East, while when French came to the East and people were taken into Catholicism early on for generations before the Indian residential schools came around, in the West this was a very different kind of experience. And so one of the goals that the Prime Minister had at that time was that he thought that First Nation people could really benefit from becoming Christian. And these statements are throughout all the public records by everyone that you can imagine, from leaders in the church to leaders in local government, about how important it was that, Indians, among Indians, the first object is to make them better men, and if possible, good Christian men. So basically, there were four major points. The first one was that the Canadian government actually collaborated with churches on the development of this model. So for those of you who are from the United States, this idea of separation of church and state, this did not exist at that time. And there are implications for that are discussed in the literature. But it's significant to understand, intellectually, and you'll get to why this is important in a few minutes, but that the government and the church, for all intents and purposes, for people who went to Indian residential schools, were one entity. The second point that's relevant to this is that this was based, like I said, on a funding model. And the funding model had pretty significant implications for First Nation people in Canada. The idea here was to make these schools economically self-sufficient. So that when children went to the schools, they were taught tasks that could produce revenue that would help the schools run. Initially, these were agricultural tasks. And then you remember from the picture a couple slides ago, sewing. And so children in these schools would actually labor and produce goods for sale. And then those sales, the money from those sales would support the ongoing maintenance of the school, which is an important thing to conceptualize about what that does to a person's understanding of work in the world and what work means. And then the other thing was that children were taken from homes without any parental rights whatsoever. And people will talk about scoop-ups. When you talk to survivors, they will talk about literally military organizations coming through reserves and just taking children that were seen out and just, no due process whatsoever. And then last but not least, as we discussed, the idea was, the reason the churches saw this as being beneficial was that, it would give them an opportunity to convert many, many young people to Christianity. These two pictures are really interesting because they were seen as significant propaganda. And the one is, you can see a young man who has a Plains kind of wardrobe and what he looks like after being indoctrinated into the Indian residential school. And you could write like a dissertation on this picture. And then pictures like this are very common, where you can see the nuns and the children together preparing for the academic environment. Again, these were seen as positive propaganda for the schools as they existed. So to me, probably the most powerful part of this is that children were actually punished for speaking their native language. And so the idea here was to remove children from their families and thereby disrupt the family and the community that they came from, so destabilize the community. And one of the best ways to separate parents and children is through language. Now, many of you have, like me, worked with people who are new Americans. And one of the most difficult things about coming to this country as a new American with children is that children learn the language usually much faster than parents do. And when you talk to parents of new American families, they'll talk about how difficult it is to have your child be the arbiter of language. And language, as you're all very, very aware, is very political. And so, to me, one of the most powerful parts about this presentation, and the reason I talk about the subject instead of the Maliseed, is like the value and meaning of language in somebody's life. I'm a dad, and I can remember the very first words all of my children spoke. They were in a language that was shared with me. And I just say this to you because, being separated from your parents against their will, against your will, sent basically into indentured servitude, like all that stuff's not good. But imagine that you go home and you can't speak the language of your parents. So I just... So Dan Gordon, who's an attorney, who's written very powerfully on the relationship between church and state and how separations in church and state can have are important for American culture and how they can have unintended consequences in other cultures. He spoke very specifically about significant issues affecting the world student with, and he basically said that what started off as this social experiment to try to get an assimilated, everybody's working together for one Canada kind of thing, quickly turned into a disastrous, competition for culture. And I swear Dr. Rambo and I did not compare notes directly before this, so I am not plagiarizing. Please don't turn me into academic affairs. But, the reality is this idea about competing histories. One of the reasons why this whole construct around we all have to be one, everybody has to be similar, like it just kind of makes it neat and easy. If you think the way I think, if you feel the way I feel, if you talk the way I talk, it just kind of makes it easier for me. And if I'm in power, that's kind of the way that the pedagogy is going to roll itself out. And so, there are tons of stories of the kinds of abuse that existed in Indian residential schools. Somewhere over 100,000 young people attended these schools. There are stories and documented deaths of young people that were covered up by the institutions and organizations that had these schools. There was also significant reports about physical abuse in these schools. And I'm not just talking about reports that were given by survivors about things that happened. Some of the forms of physical abuse, like things that happened at Shubenacadie, actually made the paper. Again, as promotion, as an advertisement, right? If you wanted to get, a young First Nation person to behave well, you could send them to this school because this school would, by conversation or by subterfuge or by torture, get them to behave in a particular way. And so these stories of physical abuse involve children under the age of 12 being hospitalized after beatings, being put in comas. And then the stories of deaths were not as public in the newspaper, but have significant power in the communities from which they come, in some cases 40, 50, 60, 70 years after the fact. And there are also significant stories of sexual abuse that happened in these schools. Ritualistic sometimes in nature. Sometimes these sexual abuse stories were, student to student, but much, much more often than not, they were about people working in the church or under the auspices of the church who are actually hurting the children sexually. And so, reflecting earlier on readings that we had early in the semester about the impact of trauma that comes from the church, and what does that do to one's relationship with the church. So I just want to point here a second again to a little bit of the difference between a Western tribe where there maybe was not a significant amount of colonialization that involved Christianity, in the eastern part of the country where I was working, where for hundreds of years before the Indian residential schools occurred, people were growing up in the Catholic Church. Well, Studnia have on Tobic have the Catholic Church on the reserve. And of the 6 reserves, I believe the Catholic Church is on 3 of them. And I just want to refocus on that for a second. So, a really great paper was written about the impact of growing up, the trauma impact of working on Indian residential schools. And by the way, you may notice that I'm going to be referring to papers through this conversation because there's not a significant body of research that looks at Indian residential schools in Canada or residential schools in the United States. And so there's not, a canon. There are researchers out there that are working to tell this story. And the trauma story is extremely interesting because this is, we have a Western perspective on trauma and what trauma means, and then the people that we're working with have another experience of trauma, which is not always a perfect fit. And as I hope, going to be one of the more interesting parts of what we talk about this morning. But all these words that seem familiar to you. Judith Herman talks about all of these things. But the one thing that doesn't get talked about is the guilt and shame of Indian residential school survivors. And this, I'm going to come back to this a couple times, but it involves the shame of being taken from your home. And, at a certain developmental age, the only reason you're taken from your home is because you did something. And, all the king's horses and all the king's men can't really wrap that back, right? It's hard to unpack that and make that right for a small child, right? And so you've been taken from your home because you did something wrong and taken to the place where God is going to educate you, and that didn't work out so well. And you can't really go back to your home, and you certainly can't go back to the church, so where do you go? Okay? And and at some point when you start to consider the victim-offender continuum, many of these children ended up doing things in their lives that were difficult for them to reconcile. And so they have guilt over things they've done and shame over the people that they believe that they are. And even as I say that, I should have said this earlier on. I love the school of theology. I really do. You all have really graciously and openly welcomed me into this classroom, and I've really grown as a human being just from being here. And so what I'm about to say, I hope, is received with the best intentions. But these stories that I'm flipping through, these are sacred stories. These stories hold the fate of the people. And so as I start going through them and I start telling them, sometimes I forget. I'm speaking about pieces of information I will share with me and my friends that are all about people's souls. So as I start kind of going down this path, I wanted to refocus on that for a second. And so I have a long history as a substance abuse counselor, and I've always thought addiction is a pretty interesting kind of spiritual piece. I think of addiction in very spiritual kind of terms. And so I came into this work as a person who had a history of working with substance abuse and with trauma. And so one of the things that was absolutely, different about the way I thought about trauma, before I got here, was the power of historical trauma on somebody's life. Because by the time I started working in New Brunswick, the Indian residential school had been closed for 30 years. Right? Now, I met survivors from other schools that attended those schools afterwards, right? And so the people that I was talking to that actually went to the schools were people that were my age or older. But we had lots and lots of people that we worked with that were the children of those people. And now the grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And so, to me, it's, I found this great paper written about Native Americans by Ellers, and basically the point of her paper is that if you talk to Native Americans, about their experience of themselves. There's no way to separate that from the historical loss of the community. And so what was interesting to me as a trauma guy, right, as a white European person of privilege, trauma guy, I'm sorry, hold on, I just had a problem here. I love technology. Okay, good, sorry. As a white European trauma guy, being invited onto the reserve was like coming into context of like just the way I looked. Like, what did that represent being there? You know, just walking on the reserve. And for those of you who've not worked, or you know, I don't know you all well, so I'm not sure like what massive piece of your experience I'm speaking over right now. But so I don't know if any of you worked on reserves. It's a big deal to be a European to be invited to work on a reserve. I'm sure there's probably a better way of putting that, but it's not a slight thing to be invited onto the reserve. And the first times I went, I was a guest of somebody else. And so for me, I had to like somehow come into terms with that in a very, very real way. You know, because it wasn't like being a white European guy and working in a neighborhood that wasn't my neighborhood. The reserve has with it a sense of safety from people like me. Right? The whole idea of the reserve is to protect people from people like me. And now all of a sudden I'm being invited to go, and how do you manage that? And then the other piece of it that I think is really important is that these images, one of the things that's fascinating about this particular image and the way I showed it was after a while of working on the reserve, I got invited into people's homes. And we would go into people's homes and break bread with people. And I can't tell you how many homes I walked into in Tobit where the beds were made up just this way. So first you have to look at the fact that the people that you're working with are survivors of Indian residential schools. And what does that mean? But, you know, believe it or not, you can kind of operationalize that. You can work with people, you can listen to them, and we'll talk a little bit about what that process was like. But you can start there. And then after that, you start to look at, you know, that in many cases people felt rejected by church. And this is interesting for us because the main gathering place that we would meet on Tobit was a community center that was literally 60 yards from the church. So if you were sitting in a particular chair in a particular room and talking about this stuff and you looked out a window, you'd see the church. And then these people, many of the people that I worked with felt rejected and unable to actually attend church services anymore. There was incidents in the 1980s where people would break into the church without clergy being present, just so that they could sit in the church because they didn't feel like they could go to services. I got to say something about tribe in a little bit. So on the Tobit Reserve, there are about 1,000 people, and there may be like, of that 1,000 people, I would say maybe 600 to 700 of them belong to the same three families. So this idea of family and it's very powerful. And if you look up Tobit on the internet and you go to like who the chiefs have been for the last 30 years, you'll see like the same 3 or 4 different names. And so, like I said before, these people went to the school and they came back from the school and they didn't fit in with their family of origin anymore. And in some cases didn't feel accepted by their tribe. Before I ever came along, before Judith Herman came along, actually even before Bessel van der Kolk and all, like believe it or not, like Native people have ways of looking at healing, and we'll talk about some of those, right? And some of them are very powerful and super effective. But a lot of the people that we worked with felt extreme discomfort in traditional methodology. So now you have the added dynamic of you're a Western guy, and people want a Western healing method, and then you're on a reserve where people aren't sure why you're there in the first place, and they have their own healing method, and how did the politics of that play out? And then, the dominant culture, how did an American get on a Canadian Indian reserve? Well, one of the reasons we got there was that the Wellstukviak did not feel good about going to their own healthcare people, because it's not just the church that's combined with government in Canada, it's also the healthcare system. And I'm a big fan of like public health, and a big fan of health insurance, but in this particular instance, people felt reluctant to go to that because they just saw it all as the government. And then we talked a little bit about intergenerational trauma. An event happened in 2008 called the Apology, which was at the peak of my time in Tobic, and it was basically the Canadian government stood up and said, we blew this. This is really bad. We're really sorry. Not good. And here's money and resources and a plan. And that apology was not met with universal welcome by people in First Nation community. There's also environmental factors. If you've never been to New Brunswick, and I'm a city guy, like we drove a long, long way through a lot of nothing to get to Tobic, right? And I get a little nervous when I'm outside the cities. And, well, I did until I used to go up there, but for a long time I get nervous when I wasn't in the city, and that place really did a good aversion therapy for me, because you're literally in the middle of nowhere. But interestingly enough, on the reserve there's a significant amount of poverty, substance abuse, right, domestic violence, and one of the major issues that brought our team in was there were huge rates of suicide. Church and state connection we've covered. Lawsuits, right? One of the reasons the Canadian government apologized was because individuals were suing the government. It was getting out of hand. But there are tons of lawsuits, and people suing the tribe and suing each other, and that was an interesting factor. Intertribal disputes, and this relates directly to what Dr. Rambo was talking about. There were people from different parts of the country that would say, well, our form of Indian residential school abuse was more intense than your form of Indian residential. You can't really call yourself a survivor. We are. The school is only open this long there. Ours were open for 200 years. We have deaths. You're telling us stories about teacher hitting your tongue with a needle, and that kind of. And we were involved while this project was on huge national powwows on this, and you could see that play out. So it would be a little overwhelming if all we were dealing with was intergenerational complex trauma, right? But no, there are also health issues, right? And the health issues were very significant in a group of people that did not get good health care, and also had lots of behaviors that promoted lots of physical illness. So we spent a lot of time in hospital rooms while we were up there. Publicity. There was a while when it was really popular to be an Indian residential school survivor, and the media drummed up about a group of 20, and then that group got down to about a group of 5, and there were 2 or 3 people that were on every show everywhere. And so one of the issues became for people well, if I tell my story in such a way, will I get some kind of social recognition out of this? And then if people did get social publicity recognition, that would separate them from the tribe and from others. Obviously, co-occurring mental health issues. So just because you have an issue related to trauma doesn't mean that you don't have other issues that exist that are outside of trauma that need treatment, that complicate your trauma treatment. And then the aging cohort of actual residential school survivors was a significant issue, because then their disruption to the community is only felt through their children and their grandchildren, who are seen to have less of a claim on being in pain because they didn't actually go to the schools. And then the big one was the lack of trained trauma personnel. And so how did this whole thing happen? Well, a group of all studio ended up going to an alcohol and drug treatment conference in 1997 or early 1998. And they met a guy who had just got done doing a training on stress debriefing, CISM, critical incident stress management. And so they started talking over coffee, and one of the local people said, well, we need you to come up and work with our people. And that was the way it started. And so that group of people in 1998 got together, and they started working on this idea about how do we work with each other, how do we start to cooperate. And in 1999, they did the initial CISM training, and they basically they figured out a way to use something called the medicine wheel to make the CISM training seem more culturally appropriate to people at Toby. In 2000, I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to go here. In 2000, they integrated sweat lodges and healing circles and pipe ceremonies into the work that was done that involved CISM and those traditional methods. In 2001, it was huge. The group of people that were there were invited to attend a Sundance, which is a very important and sacred ritual. And it's not a place where many non-First Nation people go. In 2003, co-facilitation training started to develop for other Aboriginal communities. So the other reserves in Canada, and then other reserves for other, Algonquin people, and then later it switched to the Midwest and to the far west of Canada. In 2004, which is when I came on board, we started looking at the integration of the MDR into the clinical protocols. And that was really seen as a very powerful piece for us to become involved in. Then in 2005, we worked on violence prevention. 2006, we did a significant amount of work around suicide prevention. So now that I'm in 2006 and I've been in the project 2 years, what I want to explain to you is how this happened. The First Nation people would come and talk to the people from the group that I was with, and they'd say, what are you doing? And we'd tell them about what we were doing, and they would literally look at that and say, well, we want to do some of that. And then we would sit down together with them over the course of about 6 months and develop some way to kind of Tobic-ize whatever was going on. And then what the give me for us was we got to bring the traditional medicine work back into our work in New England. So that was kind of the trade-off of the work. There was a BC research project that was done in 2007, and the big lesson from that was that if you're going to work in an Indigenous community, you really need to respect the Indigenous community. So I said that quickly, but I really want to say this because a lot of times we don't think we're in Indigenous communities when we are. I'm acutely aware that I am not a theology student every time I sit in this room. And it's not because any of you make me feel uncomfortable. You've all been really gracious, really kind to me. Right? But I'm acutely aware that this is not my space. Right? And there's a certain tentativeness to that. Right? Well, sometimes when we're working in other communities, we forget that tentativeness. Right? Kind of try to seek it out maybe a little too much sometimes. Anyway, so we got recognized in 2008. After 10 years of doing the project, the group wanted to start another 5 years of the project. In 2009, we worked more with substance abuse protocols and tried to introduce the idea of trauma-sensitive work in the substance abuse treatment model there. So created an actual treatment track for intergenerational survivors of Indian residential schools. And by 2010, what we were doing was getting ready to pull ourselves out of it. So we just created models of training and people, sharing the training with among themselves and different other groups and other reserves across Canada and in some cases in North America. And then one of the coolest things that happened right before we left was a few of the medicine people got together and talked to us about developing trauma-sensitive traditional medicine. Right? Right? And the reason I was really nervous when we got asked to go second, because I really wanted to be the bad opening act and let Shelley clean up. But one of the reasons I was really grateful that Lisa came today is because I really, like, when I first started reading about Bessel's work with yoga, I thought, man, there's really something to this. But then you start to talk to people who do yoga, and everybody thinks they're doing trauma-sensitive yoga. I was really glad that Lisa came today and showed what I think is like the state of the art, right? Because many of you had a conceptualization of what yoga is before Lisa got here, and then Lisa did this other thing, right? Well, that's what the trauma-sensitive traditional stuff looks like. Like, there's a different way of doing the sweat lodge, right? So that was fun. So basically, the medicine wheel was the way that we got introduced to this. It started in 1998. I didn't get there until 2004. But this became the foundational model for all dialogue of everything that we did. And literally every conversation that we had when we went to the reserve. And, let me just tell you a little bit about going to the reserve. I'm going to digress and I'll come back. So we all did this part-time for free, right? We did this, and so we would leave work on Friday at 3 o'clock and drive 6 or 7 hours to Canada. And then we would get to the reserve and we'd have to go through a welcoming ceremony to go to bed, to get up at the next morning at 6 to start a 14-hour day. And a lot of times that day involved sweat lodge, physically active kind of stuff. Well, every conversation we had would start with the conversation of how were you doing in terms of mind, emotions, physical body, and spiritual. And one of the biggest, coolest events that ever happened. So one night we got in there about 2 o'clock in the morning in this main building, and there's a huge national conference. And we got there, and there were a group of medicine women who were not aware that Anglos were going to be on the reserve. And so at 2 o'clock in the morning, they came and formally protested us being there. And we didn't have anywhere to stay. So we had a conversation from 2 o'clock in the morning until 5:30 in the morning about about whether or not we could stay. And then finally, I'm not kidding, an eagle landed on the porch outside of the building we're on, and they figured that meant that it was okay for us to stay. Right? But at the end of that conversation, we all went to well, how are you doing physically? How are you intellectually? How are you spiritually? Do we implement this program in the autumn, the winter, the spring, or the summer? Because for me, before I got to Tobit, those are just times, right? But my understanding, and I am in no way pronouncing myself to be an expert in First Nation theology, but to me, the biggest piece that I got out of my work was that nature and the weather and the world, these weren't things. These were all ways of communicating with the sacred ground. And so for us, in order to create safety, we would have long conversations that, didn't really operate on a linear kind of agenda about what they wanted to do, what they thought our contributions would be, what we needed from them. I can tell you this, when we got to the reserve, everybody on the reserve knew we were on the reserve. So we would, as a Western clinician, I'm really trained about this whole idea about confidentiality. So if I'm in a meeting with Shelley and she says something that blows my doors off, I'm like, wow, that's between me and my supervisor, the creator, right? But I'd leave the meeting with Shelley, and I'd literally drive to the place to get some food, and 3 people would come up and be like, I heard you just had a powerful meeting with Shelley. Right? And so what do you do with that as a Western trained clinician? And so we had to talk about, those kinds of things that we weren't comfortable with, I mean, I know it's your grandmother, but and I get I'm in a place that's not my place, but I'm not going to do it. I'm certainly not going to do it at the diner. If I'm going to do it, so those kinds of conversations. Probably the best thing I can tell you about my spiritual development is, like I said, I grew up in New Jersey. I was really terrified of nature, and by the time I worked, I grew up in New Jersey. I was terrified of nature. I was terrified of anything that had to do with the woods and all that kind of stuff. And I was living in New Hampshire when I did this, but by the third year I was at Tobic, I actually started liking nature. And now I think it's a really important part of my life. And it may sound crazy, but I don't see anything as random anymore. You know, I don't see like the sunrise as random. I don't see like a bird flying over as random. I don't see that. I don't see it that way anymore. You know, when I smell the leaves coming off the trees, that means something to me. We had lots of conversations about being oppressors or working with the oppressed. And some of those conversations were really, really hard. And they were really, really worth it. And I hope they never stop happening for me. You know, I noticed, you two haven't died. And it's like, I wanted to say, like, that's the sweet spot. The sweet spot is like, I don't understand what you're, and when you're up there and you're like, oh man, what does it mean when I said this? It can be really hard. But man, being willing to like stand on that ground and learn and grow, it's So that was a very powerful thing for me. And the idea of sharing ceremony was very sacred. Very, very sacred stuff. So like I don't smoke cigarettes, but if I'm offered a peace pipe, like I'm gonna make sure I take care of my obligation in that place, right? And a couple places I got to like make fires. No, it was cool. I got to be a fire maker for cooking the stones, or, heating up the grandfathers, as we used to say. So to me, I'm just really conscious of time. So to me, the biggest part about this process was looking at trauma as a community event, right? And there were people that were more and less in agreement with that, right? But I got there in 2004, and for about the first 6 months I would go, my basic instruction was like, don't say anything. It really was. So I brought my guitar, and I just played guitar, and after a while I got a name, a guy who plays guitar badly, right? And then one of the survivors who used to play guitar would like come and he would sit with me, and he'd ask me to play him songs, and I'd play him songs. And that was like my therapeutic intervention for 6 months. It was like trying to remember some obscure tune from like the 1970s. And that was it. It wasn't about like, let me come, help you. It was about, all right, A, are you going to show up? Are you going to put the energy in to actually build and create community? Are you going to be present for that process? Or is this just something like you're doing so you go do the next thing? And then it was about really, like, for me, just really trying to make sure that I was paying careful and strict attention to the feedback that I was getting from people there. And what I found after a while was that, that this group of people really came to support me. This is something I look forward to. I look forward to not sleeping one weekend a month. And you come back on Monday after being at Tobic, and a friend of mine, Jack, talked about this, and people would say like, "Well, how was your weekend?" And be like, "Oh, I caught a movie." It's like, what happened to you? Well, I was in the Sweat Lodge where a medicine man transformed himself into a spirit wolf, right? I mean, how do you really bring that back, like into like, right? It was a very kind of like private and intimate and powerful experience. And through the time I was there, I saw people start to heal. I met a woman who wouldn't speak to any man in 2004, who like became a preacher in her community, became a medicine woman. I met kids who could not make it through school without being like thrown out, who graduated from school and are actually like finding a way in the world for themselves. I saw many, many people not healed by me, right? They're healed by a process that was about community. So, like when Shelley said before, like healers, when you meet them, like every time I hear that word, I get a little nervous. Because I've never met anybody who really likes to think of themselves as a healer. I don't know. Maybe I have. I just don't know that. The whole idea around community sharing. One of the things that I learned on the reserve that I try to bring back into my regular life is that everybody has a place at the table, whether they're sitting at the table or not. And it's really important for me to remember that just because somebody doesn't show up at the meeting or somebody doesn't come to their appointment or whatever doesn't mean that they're not in the room. And we spent a lot of time in Tobic thinking about the people that weren't in the room. And then we did something that was really Tobic-esque. If somebody didn't show up enough, we'd just go find them. It was crazy. You just go knock on somebody's door. Somebody was late for dinner, and 4 people would get in the car. They'd go get in the person and bring them back for dinner. We did a lot of eating together. Not a big fan of moose, but if it's cooked right, wow, right? Yeah, and I gotta tell you, right, I met people who can really cook moose and fiddleheads. Never thought I'd dig them, but man, I've eaten the King's Ransom, the fiddleheads, and then there's the stories behind the fiddleheads and the stories about how people remember collecting fiddlehead and fiddlehead season and how it relates to spring and how this is about your emotional being, and all of a sudden you're like, oh wow, there's a whole different way of relating to the world, and somehow I'm part of a culture that tried to disenfranchise people from that. I had a clinical supervisor a long time ago told me there's 2 kinds of clients that you'll meet as a clinician. He said, there are clients that you will teach, and there are clients that will teach you. The people at Tobic all taught me a lot more than anything I did. And the reason I wanted to bring this to this class was that a part of this that was really important to me was the whole community cohesive piece. This is the first time as a clinician that I'd sat down with clergy in a very deliberate way. Other than being called into a church after a tragedy or something like that, recognize that the clergy in Tobic had a very intense, deep, and conflicted relationship with the people in its parish. And had, differing levels of ability to engage and disengage with that, but were never excluded from the table. Right? And I guess I would just sort of say is that, in conclusion, besides thank you so much for being so gracious and listening to this book. Now, I had a brief conversation, and I talked to a couple of you in this room, and probably all of you before it's over, are doing some incredibly important and powerful work. Thank you for that. And thank you in advance for trying to continue to be vigilant about attending to the power of that will. Because the first worst lesson I learned as a therapist is that my clients listen to everything I say. It's a little bit worse. Like when your kid regurgitates stupid stuff you say to your kid, right? It's worse when a client does that. It was for me. It was somehow, right? So all I'd say to you is I learned a lot from working with them. I hope this in some way informed you, and I really, very thankful that you gave me this time. That's all I've got. Thank you.